So I'm very, very happy to be able to introduce our first keynote speaker today. His name is Bartel. His PhD at Cornell and is now assistant professor, Department of International Affairs at Texas A&M University's Bush School of Government Public Service. And he's written what I think is really one of the most important books on neoliberalism, been published in the last few years anyway. I spent much of the last week reading it. It's very long. It's a book. It's hard to skim. I mean, it's just, I'm usually good at skimming, but I was like, I can't skim this. It's too important. I have to pay attention to every line. It does just an extraordinary job at tying together, even already in this morning's papers. Like you can see how, I can see anyway, how your narrative helps to sort of assimilate into a single kind of plausible storyline. Many of these things happen in seemingly far-flung places. And so I'm very happy that you'll be able to introduce to us a kind of overview of the book, which you should all nevertheless buy, regardless of its rather high sticker price, and immediately. So that's.
Thanks so much, Quinn. And thank you all for letting me be a part of this wonderful event. These papers were extremely interesting, extremely impressive. I've decided the only reason I'm up here as a keynote is I can't incorporate your feedback in my and so that would be a distinct disadvantage, I think. But I'm very happy to be here and to hopefully contribute something to this literature on and this debate, this conversation that we've all been having at this conference and for many years now on the rise of neoliberalism, the many births and foretold deaths, as we've titled this conference. As Quinn said, I'll walk you through some of the main arguments of the book, and I'll highlight a couple of points that I think primarily are the strongest points of crossover between this project, which also tries to explain the geopolitical end of the Cold War and tie that to the rise of neoliberalism. But I'll spend a little bit more time reflecting on the neoliberalism part, of course. So when I started about a decade ago working on this project, and I came across this figure that the Eastern Bloc was $90 billion in debt to Western governments and capitalist banks, it was a kind of astounding thing to me. I couldn't understand why communists would borrow from capitalists. I couldn't understand why capitalists would lend to communists. And I had no idea. I really wasn't even sure that I'd be able to offer an answer to what this fact had to do with these seismic events of 1989. But of course, on a global level, when you pull back from the particular Cold War context or Cold War in the global North context, this is a relatively unexceptional fact. The idea that there were states that were highly indebted in the 1980s and that this may have produced seismic political change and social upheaval is a relatively would be a not an interesting statement depending on what region of the world you're talking about. And so in some ways, this project is an attempt to reintegrate the kind of traditional Cold War in traditional places with traditional events like the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall into those broader narratives of the global 1980s. And so I hope it offers a new way to answer a couple of different questions that have been longstanding ones for various historiographies. Why did the Cold War end first? Of course, an enormous question for Cold War historians and international relations theorists and people like that. And I'm going to suggest that the answer to all of these questions is really an integrated one. Why did it end relatively peacefully? Because this was something that no one predicted, and the reason they couldn't foresee or couldn't project how the Cold War would end was because it was always assumed that it would end in kind of violent fashion. And why did it end up ending relatively peacefully is the second question. What role did the West, broadly speaking, you can think of that in terms of Western governments, international financial institutions, private banks, and other NGOs as well, but what role did the West broadly play? This is a question that largely in terms of the European Cold War, because there was this kind of Reagan victory narrative that said, the US outspent the Soviet Union and all of a sudden they capitulated. People had largely shied away from or understood that the end of the Cold War was something that the West really didn't have an effect on. That again contrasts very significantly with how we think about the global 1980s in other regions, of course, where actors like the IMF have a significant influence in the course of events in other countries. So perhaps there's something different to be said about the end of the Cold War as well. And then, of course, the question that concerns all of us here: what connection did all of this have to the rise of neoliberalism? Which I'll tell you how I think about that and how I understand that for this book project in just a minute. So to answer these questions, I felt ultimately that I actually had to kind of reconceptualize for myself anyway and offer a new definition of what the Cold War actually was. And so in the book, I argue that the Cold War really began as a race between democratic capitalist countries and state socialist countries to expand the social contracts that prevailed in their societies. But because of the economic crises of the 1970s, it ended as a competition to discipline those social contracts. And in other words, it began as a race to make promises. And I talk about the politics of making promises in the book, but it ended as a race to break promises. Whichever side could ultimately break the promises that it had made to its people in the first few decades of the post-war period would ultimately be the one that survived. So using that new understanding of what the Cold War was, the argument then unfolds in a number of different steps. So first of all, after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 and the oil shock of 1973, the rise of global capital and energy markets exploded. They exploded in size, and then they put immense pressure on governments to impose economic discipline on their populations. So they offered in the first instance actually a way of avoiding economic discipline, avoiding the pressures of adjusting to economic change. But then ultimately they came around, of course, by the 1980s. And we can talk more about it, of course. Is it markets doing this? Is it states? Is it particular institutions? But I do think there's a role to actually understand markets themselves as something that is having an effect here. And nevertheless, they put pressure on governments to impose discipline on their populations. Those that could impose discipline survived. Those that could not impose discipline were ultimately the ones that collapsed. And the two key elements that allowed the Western, and I hear, the global North, the democratic capitalist West to survive, were electoral democracy and neoliberalism as an ideology. These gave Western states the political and ideological tools to impose this discipline. Lacking these tools, of course, the states of the Eastern Bloc were not electoral democracies, and they had nothing close to an ideological tradition that would be something like neoliberalism. States of the Eastern Bloc democratized themselves, they liberalized their political systems, and they reformed their ideology in the 1980s as a means of imposing economic discipline. That's what when we see pictures of the Berlin Wall and things like that, we're actually watching as a process of significant economic adjustment. And it's attempts by communist states to legitimize processes of breaking promises, processes of imposing economic discipline and structural adjustment that's actually unfolding in 1989. And so the end of the Cold War then is a triumph of broken promises, as the title of the book suggests, because it's this pressure on states to impose economic discipline on their populations that ultimately drives the political and economic change, political and ideological change that we see as the end of the Cold War, that we understand as the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War. So what does neoliberalism mean to me? This definition, it's not meant, there are many ways to think about it, but in the book, I define it along these lines: a political ideology that uses markets to increase the free flow of goods and capital across state borders, increase inequality within nation states. And this is striking the degree which it's an explicit, something that many, many people actually think will improve their societies, right, to increase inequality, and limit the state's role in the provision of economic and social security for their citizens. Often that's not the welfare, to go back to our earlier conversations, leaving the welfare state relatively intact is kind of the lowest common denominator of providing state security, as opposed to protecting people's unemployment or protecting wages or protecting bargaining rights, things like that. The welfare state, I argue in the book, actually acts as a kind of ally to breaking promises because it gives Western societies a place to send people, in a sense, to provide the kind of basic provision of goods as their lives are disrupted in many, many other ways. So one of the main claims of the book, and I think the place that it intersects most with what we're talking about here, is that when you think about neoliberalism in these terms, as an attempt to increase the free flow of capital and goods across borders, increase inequality within nation states, and decrease the state's role in the provision of economic and social security, that's actually what's both sides in the Cold War are trying to do by the 1980s. So communists, not just as much as capitalists, are trying to do these things, but so the degree to which they're trying to do it is not the same. But their ultimate aim, the direction in which they're aiming state policy, is precisely in these directions as well. So it's not a Western import in a way. Gorbachev tells the Soviet Politburo in 1987 that Margaret Thatcher and many other Western European leaders are also carrying out a perestroika of their own countries. He says they act in a rude capitalist way towards their workers. Our perestroika is based on different ideas, but we too cannot falter, he said. We too cannot turn back, in a sense. We have to ultimately carry through with the process of, in that particular case, he's talking about putting millions of Soviet workers out of jobs over time as state-owned enterprises are eventually closed down under perestroika as it's envisioned. And so the key question becomes for governments on both sides of the Iron Curtain, how exactly do you get your societies to accept this? And here you see two different attempts to do this almost simultaneously in the early 1980s. On the left is the attempt to break the miners' strike in Great Britain. And on the right is Lech Wałęsa and the rise of solidarity in Poland. And after studying these two movements, not for the entirety of my dissertation, but to a certain degree, it's still shocking to me the extent to which these were thought of as completely separate things. That not many people understood that, in fact, what was happening in both places, of course, was a union was attempting to galvanize their entire society to oppose the imposition of economic discipline. Solidarity began when the Polish government attempted to raise prices on basic goods in 1980, and then spent over a year and a half resisting the imposition of economic discipline unless it received a kind of political role in the government. Ultimately, this is resolved through martial law in December 1981. And of course, Thatcher defeats the miners' strike in the spring of 1985, infamously calling the miners the enemy within. And Wojciech Jaruzelski, the man who was governing Poland at the time, I argue, and I kind of think about in the book, could have come up with no better epithet for solidarity than the enemy within, right? But the issue was for him that he could not get Polish society to agree with him, that the union that he was facing was the enemy within, whereas Thatcher was able to do that in Great Britain. And so the differences in how neoliberalism as an ideology and then electoral democracy as a political system legitimizes policies of economic discipline in the West, but doesn't do so in the East is kind of one of the key differences that I try to bring out in the book. So that's not, of course, how the Cold War began. It began instead as a race to make promises, right? A race particularly after it wasn't going to result in World War III by 1949, 1950, the Korean War kind of settles into a stalemate. By the 1950s, it turns into a competing competition over lifestyle, the competition over how much equality and how much prosperity the two sides will be able to offer to their people and what means they'll use to achieve these kinds of goals. This is, of course, the famous kitchen debate between Nikita Khrushchev and Richard Nixon in 1959. And they're in Moscow debating which side can offer their people any steel worker, as they put it in their debate, more, better dishwashers, more dishwashers, a house, a long-term sense of economic security and prosperity, And Khrushchev is firmly convinced that the Soviet Union will ultimately win out in this contest. He says, by 1970, we'll catch up to you and we'll go past you. And as we do, we'll wave and welcome you along behind us. Right? Eventually, by 1980, the Soviet Union is going to reach communism itself at the final stage of development in Marxism and Leninism. So the two sides are competing with each other by trying to offer, by not just trying, but actually delivering on the promise to provide their people with an equitable and bountiful distribution of modernity's good life, as I call it in the book. What they couldn't have known at the time, but we can certainly see in retrospect, was that this era of making promises was based on a historically unique period of economic growth, world economic growth that had never come before and has not come since. And here you see GDP per capita growth, 1950 to 1973 is the dark line in the middle. This is the world, the USA, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the USSR. That was the period that, if we think about it in the West, the golden age of capitalism. In the East, the 3 decades where they could legitimately incredibly claim to their populations that they were actually catching up with the West occurred during this period from 1945 to the early 1970s. And then around 1970, the unexpected happens in both systems, right? The economy kind of grounds to a halt. We think of the era of stagnation, depending on whether you study socialism or capitalism the most, right? You could think of it as something that only affects one side or the other, but in fact affects both sides equally, and right around 1970 as this key turning point. And instead of economic growth, then the oil shock of 1973 delivers these two new massive pools of wealth into the world economy, right? If you're an energy producer, you're an oil producer in particular, you see, of course, the real price of oil quadrupling in 1973, 74, and then again skyrocketing in 1979. So if you're the Soviet Union, this arrives as a massive windfall for you. If you're any number of countries that is not primarily an energy producer, you can turn to capital markets, which are also exploding in size, particularly the unregulated Euro markets, as a means of kind of gaining access to wealth and continuing to make promises to your citizens. So in the book, I call this phenomenon the privatization of the Cold War. The race to make promises now dependent on finance and energy. If nation states maintained access to energy or finance, they could continue making promises to their people at home and fighting the Cold War abroad. If, however, when they lost access to either energy or financial wealth, they would have to turn the politics of breaking promises. They would have to turn to economic discipline. So diplomacy during this period then consists, right? That's a market-led process. That's a private process. So what role are states playing? Diplomacy consists in either granting or denying access to energy or finance on both sides, right? And so if you're the Soviet Union, the easiest way to think about this is in Eastern Europe, where the Soviet Union is offering highly subsidized energy deliveries to its allies as a means of trying to control them. This is the estimated annual oil and gas subsidy that the Soviet Union is providing its Eastern Bloc states. And you can see, particularly after the second oil shock, it's on the order of $10 to $12 billion a year. If that's what the Soviet Union is trying to do, over here you see one of the most bizarre things I think you can find in the 1970s, the cover of Euromoney magazine, which is the kind of flagship publication for the Euro markets and the kind of leading edge of deregulated, unregulated finance. In 1977, January 1977, they kind of do an issue looking back on the year before, and the single greatest phenomenon happening on the Euro markets in 1976 had been lending to the Soviet bloc. Right, so there's this kind of symbiotic relationship, this mutual dependency developing between unregulated finance capitalism and state socialism, which is using finance capitalism to defend itself against the capitalist system. And so this kind of dependence on one hand on finance, the other hand on energy, becomes the way that many states try to exist throughout the 1970s. This won't be news to this room, right? But this process can last only so long as there's easy money flowing through the system. And that comes to a screeching halt when the United States has to confront its own challenge of breaking promises in 1979 through 1983, the Volcker shock of this period when interest rates, as we know, skyrocket to historically unprecedented levels that we haven't seen anywhere close to even in recent times either. The question becomes, how was Volcker able to do this? How was he able to impose so much economic discipline on the American population without inviting a kind of destabilizing social backlash? I think we assume that he would be able to do something like this because that's what capitalists do. But when you look at it in contrast to what happens in the Eastern Bloc, it's really quite astounding how he's able to do this. So in the book, I try to trace one of the ways that he does this is by supposedly turning to monetarism, this attraction to Milton Friedman's the doctrine targeting the money supply rather than interest rates in particular. And it's interesting to look at. He doesn't actually do this out of any intellectual attraction to the idea of monetarism. Instead, what he's doing, as Charles Schultz of Carter's chief economic advisor says, right, the move to monetarism was, in the broadest sense, a political move, not an economic move. In theory, the Fed could have kept raising the bejesus out of interest rates, but that's not what it could do politically. The beautiful thing about this new policy was that as interest rates kept going up, the Fed could say, we're not raising rates, we're only targeting the money supply. Thus, they could raise rates and nobody could blame them. In other words, everybody could say, look, no hands. Right? So I think about it as a neoliberalism in a way as the look, no hands doctrine. And it's the way to, of course, to shift the market, the social and economic outcomes that actually state administrators, state officials are still controlling. Right? But you're able to deny responsibility, shift responsibility for those outcomes to quote unquote market forces. Right. So in one way, neoliberalism works by using this evasive shift no hand, look no hands move. Of course, the other more traditional way to think about it is these standard rhetorical demonizations of how and what the state should be doing. Right? We know these quotes. Reagan in his first inaugural, government is not the solution to our problem, it is the problem. Thatcher, it's not the state that creates a healthy society, instead a great nation. It's the product of countless acts of personal self-confidence and self-reliance. This is very much the standard neoliberal story, right? More surprising, I think, is what's happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain. This is senior Gosplan economist writing to Gorbachev right before he's he's going to become General Secretary of the Communist Party, January 1984. This is what he says. Socialism is not collective philanthropy. The view is becoming more and more common among economists. And here he's not talking about any Western economists, this is through and through Soviet economists, that the free provision of goods weakens incentives to work. And seems to me Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher would fully agree with the statement. There's really no difference between how they're thinking about these things at this moment. That was in private, this was in public. Gorbachev in May 1988. We must rid ourselves once and for all of the notion of socialism as something that levels, as a sort of minimum, the minimum of material benefits, a minimum of justice, a minimum of democracy. And throughout, I track in the book a number of socialist leaders, the leaders in Hungary, to a certain degree in Poland, and certainly in the Soviet Union, trying to reform their ideology as something that will once again coerce their population supposedly into working harder, to working more efficiently. So this idea that efficiency becomes something that you need to achieve in the 1980s, and the way that you achieve it is by removing the provision of public goods from the population, is something that's happening on the other side of the Iron Curtain, just as it's happening of course, in the West. I can't explain it fully here, but Gorbachev is of course not successful in this project. I think about perestroika in the book as an ideology of discipline, as something that, of course, is trying to do many, many things, but on the economic front, it's trying to rewrite the social contract between Soviet citizens and the Soviet government or the party. That's not something that he's able to achieve, largely because he has no legitimacy and he's not operating from an ideological tradition that allows for this kind of transformation to happen very easily. And so the story of the bloc then in the 1980s becomes one of really what the material forces are allowing to happen or forcing to happen as it might be. On the left, you see the current account balance for the communist bloc as a whole, and anything below zero is importing capital from the rest of the world. So in the 1970s, the entire bloc is benefiting from the flow of capital around the world. In the 1980s, it, of course, it turns the exact opposite direction. And the bloc as a whole, much as the global South in general, becomes a net capital exporter back to the West. And this has a great deal to do with the combination of Reagan's and Volcker's policies, the combination of high interest rates and enormous budget deficits in the United States creates an enormous appetite for surplus capital within the United States and essentially crowds out the rest of the world, including the communist bloc, from accessing capital markets. So just as capital markets are getting more coercive or more scarce for the communist bloc, Soviet energy exports and also the subsidy is also starting to level off in the 1980s as the leadership in the Kremlin realizes that they're really at the material limits of at least what they want to do for their fraternal allies in Eastern Europe. And so as I write here, right, the vice begins to close on the Eastern Bloc. It's left to Gorbachev, often thought of as a historically exceptional figure, right, to letting the bloc walk free from the Soviet Union's historic role as the protector of socialism in the Eastern Bloc. 1986, this is the East German record of the meeting at which I argue he repeals the Brezhnev doctrine, this idea that the Soviet Union will intervene in its allies' affairs to protect socialism if they ever were to deviate from it. And the reasons that he reveals it, I think, are important and revealing. First, he tells them, he scolds them, that since the 1970s, we've lived on credit. It's not so much including the Soviet Union because they were the energy, they didn't have to live on credit quite as much as the rest of the bloc did because they had the energy. But he's telling the rest of his allies, we lived on credit. And the problem with living on credit, he says, is that sooner or later, one must pay for that, pay it back. He's letting his allies know at this moment that whenever that bill comes due, the Soviet Union is not going to be the one to put the bill, not going to be the one to pay for it. In words that would be of extreme importance to any communist leader sitting in the room, he said, no socialist, no one can claim a special role in the socialist community, which of course is what the Soviet Union had been doing for many, many decades. And so it's left to the bloc allies, the leadership of the leaders in the Eastern Bloc to, in a sense, deal with their economic problems on their own. And this sets in motion the end game to the Cold War. Right? This is the Polish Roundtable of early 1989, an event that so far we don't really think about as having anything to do with sovereign debt or economic forces, or certainly not austerity to any great degree. But this is one of the documents from the IMF that kind of most changed my thinking on this. You'll see this is one IMF official writing to another, and he's summarizing a conversation he had with a Polish official where he says, the main immediate purpose of the roundtable talks is to offer political concessions so as to facilitate the implementation of the authorities' economic plans. I think they underline those two words just so I, as the researcher, couldn't possibly miss the significance of them, right? But what the government was trying to do was to very explicitly, at least to the leadership of Solidarity, invite them into the government so that Solidarity could in turn legitimize the imposition of economic austerity. Right? The roundtable results in the first semi-free elections in the Eastern Bloc since very, very early in the Cold War. through a complex and contingent process that ultimately brings to power the first solidarity government in the late summer of 1989, right? A man named Tadeusz Mazowiecki becomes the first post-communist leader in Poland, and it immediately turns to, this is the famous moment, right, when he turns to shock therapy under the partial advisement of Jeffrey Sachs and others, but really also very much of his own accord, and still with the Polish finance ministry, which is dominated by communist officials, already setting in motion an economic plan that they had been waiting for a government to be able to fulfill. And now that they had a politically legitimate government, they were able to do it. And so I just want to end with the reflections of a man named Mieczysław Rakowski, who was the last general secretary of the Polish Communist Party and the last prime minister of Poland, often referred to as the Polish Margaret Thatcher, for his attempts to really carry out all kinds of economic discipline policies in Poland in the late 1980s, including in the fall of 1988, closing the Gdansk shipyards on the grounds of economic insolvency, the fact that it was no longer economically profitable to do so. The Gdansk shipyards were the location where Solidarity had first emerged, and so to close it down was a very significant political attempt. But needless to say, he was a man who was very much devoted to the idea that the Polish social contract needed to change. And these are his reflections from his own diary as he starts to see Tadeusz Mazowiecki move towards the politics of shock therapy. He says, in principle, he says the same thing that I do. Right? There's really, in principle, no difference between what the late communists were trying to do and what the arch neoliberals were trying to do in Poland. But he laments, he must have been extremely sad that he, this is like very perverse, obviously, but if any PZPR, any Polish communist government implemented the policies that the Mazowiecki government does, we'd already have a civil war. Our society patiently bears constant price increases and hyperinflation because this is, quote unquote, our government. Right? And so this idea that having our government, the people's government, as being the key to the imposition of whatever you want to call it, breaking promises, economic discipline, austerity, and that having some kind of democratic legitimacy allows this process to unfold, I think is not only important for explaining the end of the Cold War, as I try to do in the book, but more broadly to understand exactly the mechanisms, the political mechanisms by which neoliberal policies are actually carried out. So for a long time, I think we've thought of neoliberalism as an anti-democratic force, and of course, in many ways it is, but it seems to also arrive, particularly when you include the story of the end of the Cold War and the Eastern Bloc within it, it arrives at moments where electoral democracy also arrives at the same time. And so I ultimately conclude in the book that the end of the Cold War is the moment in which the people's power peaks and the moment in which it's overcome. Right? The people's resistance to austerity was key in terms of not allowing the communist governments to do what Thatcher was able to do in Great Britain. But it's at the exact moment when they seem to achieve their goal that then their economic resistance, their resistance to economic policies is overcome. And so the result is the triumph of broken promises, as the title of the book suggests. Right? I don't think we should have any qualms about saying that the West won the Cold War, but we should be very clear about why exactly it did win the Cold War. What exactly was it winning, right? And it was winning a race to discipline social contracts. It was winning a race to break promises. And electoral democracy and neoliberal ideology were the political and economic tools that Western states had at their disposal that were not at the disposal of communist states in the Eastern Bloc. And so that's why the end of the Cold War and the collapse of communism take the particular form that it did. So anyway, I hope that was enough to get through lunch. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Fritz. Any questions from the audience? Oh,
I really enjoyed this presentation. I think it's super helpful. I mean, I'm mostly an Africanist, and I think your description, helps us put Africa, what's happening in like what we consider to be the African tragedy, also in sort of this context. But I guess, as a kind of global historian, I always wonder, do we consider China to have done something similar, or were the East Asian states able to do? Were they able to discipline their workers while not, democratizing?
Yeah.
Is that how you would fit them into this?
Yeah, I don't have a complete answer yet. I think it's one of the ways that this could be taken forward. The way that I address China in the book is by saying that it starts, let's say it starts the post-cultural revolution period in a very different place than either the developed East or West. So in terms of urbanization, 80% of the population still lives in rural areas. It doesn't have a very social contract, whatever it might have been, is in disarray. And so I think the Chinese government is, able to open parts of its geography up to spaces of capitalist exploitation and discipline, without per se having to break a previous promise that it had made to its population. Now, in 1989, much of what leads to Tiananmen looks very similar to what's happening in Poland, for instance. So there's a process of hyperinflation that begins to unfold. It contributes significantly to the protests that are ongoing. One of the key differences that I address in the book is that, for instance, many people were wondering whether or not East Germany would carry out a so-called Chinese solution in Berlin. Would they turn to violence as a way to suppress the protests? And very clearly, you can see that the East German government does not do this for a number of reasons, but one of the primary ones is that they realize how dependent they are on foreign capital to meet their domestic obligations. So if they're going to use violence, they know that they estimate it to be about a 30% fall in domestic living standards on the back end of using violence, because they're going to be completely cut off from global capital. I don't have as much evidence from China, but what I have read, there are officials debating similar questions in 1989 in China, and they say either we don't have very significant financial dependence on the West, or they have become convinced, because they're already a decade into economic growth, that the West will come back. Basically, that there'll be maybe some short-term cutoff, but over the long term, the West is too attracted to the Chinese market, either as a site of production or potential consumption, that they won't stay away for long. And so there's no kind of financial deterrent to the Tiananmen solution as there is in East Germany. Nevertheless, by the 1990s, China then, it's called the steel rice bowl. Iron rice bowl, thank you. The kind of whatever social contract there is between industrial workers and the government in China, this iron rice bowl policy, as China moves towards joining the WTO, is completely thrown out the window. Lifetime employment, kind of basic social security is thrown out the window as the Chinese social contract is rewritten. But that comes in the decade after the 1980s. But more to be looked at for how this unfolds in East Asia, certainly.
There's a question from the Zoom. I have a Maria, if you'd like to unmute.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. Two questions, actually. One, I was thinking when you gave us the definition of how you thought about the Cold War, that it was about making promises to the societies, I guess, within Eastern European states, within the USSR, or within the US, but it was also about making promises to the rest of the world, right? If you think about the developmental mission of the Cold War. So how does that does that change the story at all about making and breaking promises? That it wasn't just about, I guess, the internal societies, but the rest of the world as well. And then the second question is, where does your narrative come down, or how does it fit with this idea of there being no, or there having been no alternative to economic discipline? Is that the basic narrative here that you follow as well? Because when you talked about kind of revealing the no hands, what was it? I don't know. The
no hands doctrine, yeah.
No hands doctrine. It seemed to go into a slightly different direction, but overall, the TINA idea seems to be kind of at the heart of the story you tell. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Those are two great questions. So on the first, there's no doubt that if these two sets of promises are kind of alternative versions of industrial modernity, as I call them very briefly in the book, I don't kind of justify that term in any real sense, but I think those are projected or promised out to the rest of the world, incorporated, projected outward through the 1970s, and then of course both sides turned towards forcing their allies or other states in the international system to break promises to their own people. I don't actually see as the Soviet leadership is extremely concerned about this. So they're very concerned that any change they might make in their economic policy will force their allies to impose austerity domestically. So if you cut back energy, for instance, because they're state planners, they can calculate, they think like if you cut back, 1 million barrels of oil equals fall in living standard of this amount, right? Probably not true, but they at least try to quantify it to a certain extent. And that acts as a deterrent for them until the 1980s. So that's why it's a process that takes almost 2 decades to unfold. They can see immediately in 1973 that there's now a significant divergence between their own economic policy or interest and their allies. It takes them fully until January 1990 to actually charge world market prices for their energy to their allies. So I think there is a revision going on and kind of forcing their allies to break promises. Of course, in the West and in the United States, the neoliberal turn and the turn towards economic discipline is precisely what the Reagan administration is trying to do through its intentional policy, through what it's doing through the IMF. Even more so, it's what they're forcing the world to do by this combination, this unexpected combination between high interest rates and budget deficits. So in hoarding the world's capital, essentially, they are forcing many, many governments around the world to confront the challenge of discipline, breaking promises, because they no longer have the capital available to continue making promises domestically. So I guess I put the capital, the kind of material story before the ideational or ideological story. On the question of there is no alternative, it's something I've struggled with myself, I guess. Does this actually mean that there was no alternative? I guess I invite because it's a narrative I've crafted, right? I struggle in my own way to see where it could be different. There's a couple obvious places. There's no necessary connection between Volcker and Reagan, but the combination of them is catastrophic, or it's much, much more consequential than one of them or the other would have been, but their combination is contingent. If this is where I grant market power, and by that I mean 300 to 400 commercial bankers spread throughout the world who are not coordinating their activities through anything except kind of herd mentality, right? But when those 400 bankers lose confidence in your society, the IMF comes in thinking, what do we need to do to regain that market confidence? we need to create an outflow of capital from that country to create the appearance, at least, or the start of debt repayment. The way to get over that, of course, is to erase the debt in the first place. And so a more non-neoliberal solution, or the solutions you're talking about in the protest movement, would have alleviated that kind of pressure. At the same time, if you're an East German official and your country is constantly running current account deficits or relying on borrowed capital from the capitalist world, it seems to me eventually the only way to safeguard socialism is to export more than you import from the rest of the world, because that's how you gain power or prevent the capitalist world from gaining power over you. How the socialist world could have become the Japan and the West Germany of the 1980s, I don't know. That's an enormous counterfactual. But I think at least my story takes us to kind of that level of material reality or determinism, to say you create the alternatives, or you operate the alternatives by being the most successful economic countries in the world. And the most successful economic countries in the world at that point were playing by the capitalist rules at the very least. So thank you, though.
I'm going to go to Amy, who had her hand up, but can I just ask something very quickly before? But isn't China the alternative, at least for a certain period of time? It seems like that could be one way of offering an answer to that. And I think the thing that I would suggest too is there's like a parsimony to your schema, where there's sort of neoliberals do this and then non-neoliberals do that, and neoliberals can do it and others can't. But it seems like the United States has a particular role here that doesn't just fall as one in the left-hand camp or in the right-hand camp. I mean, US dollar supremacy seems to be the linchpin of really the whole argument. And therefore, couldn't one say that with that dollar supremacy, the US could have indeed, and still could, make different decisions than it did? But let's maybe chat about
my question is sort of in the same stream as the previous one, sort of global cold war sort of question. I'm debating in my head, I guess this is partly just a clarification. I haven't read your book yet, and I'm excited to do so, but partly just a clarification of whether you are fundamentally trying to explain what are, really important internal dynamics of the United States and the Soviet Union, or whether when you say the dynamic of the Cold War was, whether you intend that to be a really universalizing statement. I'm thinking about the Americas, where, I can just debate in my head, kind of to no end, whether it was about making promises. I think that, in some ways, yes, in a lot of incredibly obvious ways, not at all. One of the main functions of the US government in Latin America is to prevent governments from behaving in the way that you're describing. So are you intending this to be a kind of a specific argument or a universal argument? And then my annoying question is, what about China? What about Cuba? Do you have any thoughts? I would actually be genuinely very interested in it. It's not a gotcha question.
Yeah. So on the first, I can't with any kind of straight face or authority say that it's a universal claim, even though it's framed that way, right? I would be immensely interested to see the extent to which it holds in other places. I think it holds for the developed West, and it's the first and second worlds in the old formulation, to the extent that includes Cuba or Mongolia or Vietnam. That's the kind of peripheral case. What I'm thinking about here is largely only a global North story, really, even though the debt dynamics and the austerity dynamics by the 1980s are really ones that are just fitting into the story that's already happening or well known in the global South. So it's a particular story about a certain number of countries, the extent beyond which I can't really answer, but I would be very happy to hear how people think it fits with other areas of the world. Cuba I don't know the extent to kind of fully how it's done. North Korea is a similar example. The extent to which the famines or the hardships of the 1990s are product. I mean, Cuba also very much borrows money significantly and then has to attempt to pay it back through the imposition of austerity. Why it works there and not in Eastern Europe, it's a question for the Korean case too. I'm not sure. I've thought about reasons about geographic proximity, the fact that popular expectations play a significant role in my story. So Eastern Europeans or the Eastern Bloc is comparing itself directly to West Germany and France, and their leaders feel significantly circumscribed in what they can do because they're right next to. That's their point of comparison. What the Cuban point of comparison would be, I don't know. The extent to which they feel constrained or not based on the economic performance of some other country, I'm not sure. The North Koreans clearly don't feel any restriction based on South Korea, but they have a militarized border that's preventing their people from leaving, which the East Germans ultimately give up as a way to resolve their debt problems. But the North Koreans we're not about to do that. I guess because there's a difference between the DMZ and the Berlin Wall ultimately. But all of these kind of where the project ends is something I, in one sense, don't feel qualified to answer, and also I would love to have others kind of take that up and figure out where it ends, or the extent to which it holds.
Jen?
I think this might be a question of similar register. Thank you so much. But so I'm trying to think about what it would mean if we shifted sort of the analytic from a kind of east-west perspective to a north-south perspective, because I feel like there are different kind of social contracts that one could think about, right? So one way to sort of think about this period is that, the battle between different contracts that are being offered by the East versus West, communist versus capitalist model. But if we think about kind of the sort of post-colonial moment, there's also a domestic social contract in some ways that is being made, which is that of economic self-determination, right? And when we think about then the kind of the shift towards neoliberalism, I mean, I guess the question is, what implications this might have for the story that you're telling us about the role of democracy and political legitimacy in the advance of neoliberalism. Because I think what we're going to see in some of the papers just this afternoon is that, in fact, there was a very different feeling about the role of anti-democratic politics and the pursuit of neoliberalism in parts of the
Yeah, so Wojciech Jaruzelski, the Polish general who imposed martial law, says, and he's kind of reflecting in the early 1990s, the only way that you can carry out the economic policies we needed to, as he says, is either under a fully authoritarian government or a completely legitimate democracy, and we were neither in the kind of late 80s moment for him. That seems to be about the right answer, and why some cases, we want to use that, right? Why some countries go towards the democratic route and others, it occurs under violent or authoritarian conditions, dictatorial conditions. I think is something to explore more. I guess I'm here. I think what I'm doing is complicating or adding to the record to say that it doesn't have to end violently, right? It can be just as easily done, or was just as easily done, or maybe just as often as done via a kind of democratic reform process. And I think, I'm not a Latin America expert, but I think that holds, at least for the 80s in Latin America, right? The wave of democratization unfolds alongside and perhaps because of the wave of structural adjustment and austerity that comes along. But again, these are cases to explore. South Africa, I understand, is a similar kind of case, the end of apartheid occurring because of the apartheid government's need as they sought to kind of structurally adjust and impose austerity on their population. So I think there are two routes, and this helps us kind of gain an understanding of that, why it's democratic in some cases.
So I'll resist the temptation to, further our discussion of sort of the global South question. And I was thinking through in particular the case of Saudi Arabia and its relationship with the Reagan administration, and then it's also its role in propagating Salafi thought throughout the global South around this period. But I think that the way that I can make it more relevant to your very helpful clarifying response around this global North question is to ask you about how you see the role of ideology in your project. And so I know that I really appreciate the pushback against the more simplistic definitions of maybe like Westat Gaddis, I guess, or maybe implicitly. At least that's what I read through, the way that you presented the argument. And I do think that we need to have a more complicated understanding of what exactly the Cold War was, especially now that we have this new line of scholarship that's trying to, analyze what people are referring to as the new Cold War. And I'd love to hear what you think about this whole new Cold War discourse. But I also wonder if those old definitions were like really great in a way because they allowed for this kind of global South to fit in well, because we can think about sort of after 1989, the rise of Maoist thought and the way that sort of transitioned into this liberalism or Salafi thought in the case of most of the Islamic world, in particular, like when we think about the relationship between Saudi Arabia to most African states today, and the sort of the rise of a far right ideological discourse in that particular geographic context. Although it is, I think easy definitions are easy to, to read anywhere. So I guess that I want to hear you speak a little bit more about why should we look at this through the lens of promises rather than ideology, and what kind of added utility a more complex definition might get us, and how it, is maybe better than the definitions that we've been thinking through. And that might, I don't know, that might, I think, illuminate some of the questions that I still have about that.
Sure. Yeah.
Project. So we have a couple of minutes left, so we're going to take Stefan's question, and then you can ask about it.
Yeah, I'm just, responding to, obviously, fantastic book.
Thank you.
I had a similar moment many years ago, and I thought, there's a book there, and you've written it. Very beautiful. But, just responding to the question here and your model of, I'm really struck by your argument about the necessity of having legitimate, a legitimate political support of some form for austerity or discipline. And but I think it can't be uncoupled, can it, from the potentials for actually, you break promises, but are you able to offer / deliver on a new promise?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's lacking in the East.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really lacking in the West, or at least not in the United States. There is a promise in neoliberal self-fashioning, pseudo monetarism is also masochistic monetarism. You hunker down, you beat inflation, and there's a certain ideological purchase that seems to work really well in the United States. And also then there is an economic restructuring that is in its own way remarkably successful and brings to the fore a new constituency that supports, yes, these policies. That constituency is simply lacking for reasons of economic structure in the East. Mm-hmm. So I think that needs to. I wonder if that's something that needs to be brought in, to buttress the story about breaking promises with, well, what's the next vision that actually can carry the day?
Yeah, these are two wonderful. I'll try to remember and get to both. So ideology and why promises. So I was looking for a language and a way to think about the challenges of East and West, not to break them apart geographically. One side believes one thing, one side believes the other thing, but rather chronologically. So they're both trying, what are they both trying to do for the first half? And what are they both trying to do for the second half? And take it out of, promises are not beholden or the language of one side or the other necessarily. And so I think, in a sense, the language of promises or the structure of promises is maybe like a meta language of ideology then becomes the way in which promises are offered, structured, which promises are made, which ones aren't. And then ideology becomes the way in which you justify why you have to break promises or evade the breaking of a promise, as the case may be. So in the book, and I felt I needed to be explicit about this, right? The material challenge comes before the ideological response. So like Volcker, people only grasp for a new ideological solution when they're already presented with the challenge of breaking promises as they see it. They don't adopt an ideology and then go transform their material reality because they're convinced of the ideology. So ideological change is adopted in response to material change. And I mean, making and breaking promises, the strengths and weaknesses are in some ways evident by my inability to answer questions about East Asia because the language could be applied in many places. The extent to which it is valid, it remains to be seen, I guess. But I offer it to people to kind of think through and work with. On the question of kind of what new promise needs to be made, yeah, I completely agree that particularly for someone like Gorbachev, simply breaking promises is not enough, because what he thinks he needs is a extremely productive, newly productive socialist world as a whole that can compete with the capitalist world that he feels he's falling behind. So what he's trying to do is motivate people in a wholly new way, which includes not just changing their economic incentives, but also restructuring the ideological plane of the Soviet Union, kind of what it's trying to do. I quote in the conclusion I kind of work with this document by one of Thatcher's advisors, John Hoskins, who says at some point, we're dealing with social systems, not mechanical ones. We need people to think and feel differently in order for them to act differently. And I noticed by the time I was writing that Gorbachev would have agreed with that statement, full stop, 100%. That's what he was trying to do as well. And so as you break promises, you also need a new vision of what's going to come after and actually then somehow deliver on it, right? The neoliberal version unfolds completely, why it's successful, unfolds completely not as the neoliberals, not as Reagan anticipates. And it's not a small government, newly entrepreneurial state that takes off again in the 1980s, right? It's one that's been remade to fit the demands of international capital and then is flooded with international capital as a response, foreign capital as a response. And so the American economy takes off again and it looks like it's successful. And in so doing, it provides people with a kind of new consumerist, new legs on the consumerist promise, I guess, right? To take it to another level, which has now lasted for 3 or 4 more decades under that basic configuration. And so the socialists don't really, I completely agree, they don't have the stage, what it looks like after breaking promises is not something that they really got to, but Gorbachev was trying to get there before events caught up with him.
I wish we had more time because I want to ask you a reiteration of the idea of rising expectations, a la Rostow, or entitlement to work better, but we don't have time for that. So we have to move straight into the panel, but before we do that,